Hello Open Maze experimenters, my name is Kyle Alsbury-Neely, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to add goals and landmarks to your 3D environment trials. To do this, we're going to use a simple object place association task, and as you can see, I've already got my Open Maze project opened in the Unity editor, and I've got the corresponding configuration file docked next to it. So before we get started, you'll notice that our trials are calling scene 4, and you're going to want to make sure that you have a scene 4 added to the build. You can use your own environment, or you can use one of the tutorial environments. Go to the tutorial environments folder, open environment 1, and like always, we'll go to our build settings and add the open scene to our build. Now that that's loaded, we'll be able to use this configuration file. Okay, so our experiment right now has 3 blocks, but block order is just calling block 1, which is going to display trials 1, 2, 5, 3, and 6. So it's going to display our welcome screen, then it's going to display an Apple queue screen, then it's going to display trial 5, which is the find the apple visible scene, followed by the water queue, followed by the find water trial. And let's just go ahead and go to Unity now and play this experiment and see what happens. See, we are first presented with the welcome screen, press space through that, we get our Apple queue, and then we're placed into our environment. And if we look around for the apple, we notice that there is no apple in our scene. Okay, so we need to add this apple to our scene, and we need to add it as an interactive object so that the participant can actually collect it. So how do we do that? Well, we'll go back to the configuration file and scroll down to trial 5. We can add goal objects to trials in 3 different ways. I'll show you first how to do active goals, and then we'll move on to inactive and invisible goals later in this tutorial. So we want to add the apple as an active goal. If we scroll down to the goals section, we see that this configuration file has 2 goals. Goal 1 is our apple, and goal 2 is our water. So in order to add our apple goal to our trial, we just have to go back up to trial 5 and type the goal index into the active goals list. I'm just going to put 1 there. And we're just going to do the same for our trial 6, which is find the water 3D trial. We're going to go to active goals, and instead of goal 1, which is the apple, we're going to add goal 2, which is the water. And then we're going to save our configuration file. We'll go back to Unity and launch the experiment once again. And voila, now we see after adding the apple as a goal object that it does in fact appear in the scene. And if we go to the apple and collect it, we hear a crunch sound, the trial ends, queued to find the water, which we've added to the second trial, and when we collect the water, we hear the drinking sound, and the trial ends. Okay, so now that we've figured out block 1, let's take a look at block 2, and block 2 is find objects invisible. And it's a similar structure where we're getting our apple queue, then it's calling trial 7, then we're getting our water queue, and it's calling trial 8. So let's go down to 7 and 8 and see what's going on. So we see that in trial 7, find apple invisible, and in trial 8, it's find the water invisible. But again, like before, we haven't actually called the apple or water into our environment. Now in this case, we're going to call the object as an invisible goal. So we're going to call the apple in trial 7 and the water in trial 8. Invisible goals are the exact same as active goals, except for you can't see them when they're in the environment. You can still collect them. If the participant moves to the correct location, they'll still collect the goal. It will still initiate the next trial. So let's see if we can complete this task. We'll add block 2 to our block order. And now we're going to have the first block where we can see the objects, and the second block where we can't see the objects. We'll go back to make sure you save that, and we'll go back to Unity. And we'll launch our experiment. Our first trial, again, the object will be visible. Water is visible on this trial as well. And now we'll be queued with the apple again, but this time the apple is invisible. Now I'm going to try to find the apple, but I think it's going to be pretty difficult. Okay, I'm going to give up. Stop the experiment. So obviously our environment is very big and very open. It's very difficult to know exactly where the apple and where the water was. So what might help us is adding some landmarks to our environment. And we can add landmarks by simply adding the landmark index to our landmark list in the trial. So let's go down and see what landmarks we have to work with. In the landmarks data, we see that we have 2 landmarks. One is a red cube and one is a blue cube. Okay, great. Let's add both of them to our visible and invisible trials. So we'll just do that by adding 1 and 2 to each of our trials. And then we'll save our configuration file and go back to our Unity editor. Okay, great. Now when we're placed into the environment, we see that we have our red and blue cubes that we've called as landmarks. And what you'll notice is that when you call a landmark object, it will be called as a solid object. So as you can see, I can't move past this cube. The same is true for the red cube. And we'll just go ahead and we'll collect our apple. And then we can go and collect our water. Okay, great. And now we're going to be placed into our invisible trials. Except for this time, we know that the apple is somewhere over here by the red cube. And as you can see, if I go to the right spot where the apple was, I do collect it. We do hear that goal sound, and the trial moves on. And the same is true if we find our water object. Okay, great. So I just demonstrated how you can add multiple landmarks to scenes, but you can also add multiple goals to scenes as well. So let's take a look at block 3. In block 3, we have trial order of 4, which is our cue to find water and apple. Then it calls trial 9. If we go down to trial 9, we see find both visible. Okay, and then in trial 10, we see find both invisible. So let's fill out our goal calls that are consistent with the description of the trial. So we'll add both goals to our active goals list in the visible and both goals to our invisible list under the find both invisible trial. We'll save that, go back up, and instead of running blocks 1 and 2, we'll run just block 3. And we can add our welcome scene in here as well. We'll save that, go back to the Unity editor. All right, now we're queued with find both. And we see that both objects are placed into the scene. Remember, we didn't add our landmarks into these trials, so they don't appear. And if we collect the apple, the trial ends. And now we're faced with the invisible trial. And again, I'm probably not going to be able to find the locations without some sort of landmark, so I'm just going to exit out of here. Now, what you might have noticed is that we were queued to find both objects, but the trial ended after we only collected one. And that's because the quota in this trial is set to 0. And this means that anytime the participant collects any active goal within the environment, the trial is going to end. And in this case, we don't want that to be the case. We want the participant to be able to collect both goals before the trial ends. And to do that, we simply have to change the quota from 0 to 2. And we'll do that again for our invisible. And let's also add our landmarks back in to make finding the invisible goals a little bit easier. And then we can save our configuration file, go back to our Unity editor, and launch the experiment again. And this time we have our landmarks back. And what you'll notice is that if I collect the apple, you hear the sound, but the trial doesn't end. And that's because we've set our quota to 2. So the participant must collect at least 2 active goals in order to move on. And you see when we collect both goals, the trial ends. We're queued again. Got the invisible goals in this trial. We collect the water, collect the apple, and the experiment ends. So that's how active goals work and invisible goals work. What we haven't covered yet is how inactive goals work. So let's go back and we'll run block 1 once again. But instead this time, instead of just displaying the queued object, we're going to display the queued object and the non-queued object. So in our find the apple visible, we're just going to add water to the inactive goals list. And then we'll add our apple to the inactive goals list in find the water trial. And we'll save our configuration file. Maybe we'll add the end experiment scene into our block here. Go back to the Unity editor and try this new experiment. We see that both goal objects are in the environment, but what you'll notice is that if we go over to the water, we're not actually able to collect the water object. That's because we've defined it as an inactive goal. Inactive goals allow the participant to walk up to them, walk through them, but they aren't able to be collected. On the other hand, if we go to our apple, it's an active goal. We collect it, our quota is 0, trial moves on. And in the case of the water trial, if we try to collect our inactive apple goal, again, nothing happens. But if we collect our active water goal, the water sound, and the experiment ends. So just a couple things to note. In any trial, you can call any amount of goals that you'd like, as long as they're defined in the goal list. You can set the quota to whatever you'd like. You can have 5 active goals, but only a quota of 1, meaning that when any of the 5 goals are collected, the trial is going to end. You can have different combinations of active goals and inactive goals, invisible goals in your trial. And while I showed you a simple object association task, you can use these goals in a variety of different ways. If you're doing a wayfinding task, the participant to go to a specific location in the environment, you can place an invisible goal at the prescribed location, and when they get to that location, the trial will end. In the next tutorial, I'll show you how to create custom goal and landmark objects using any 3D object or 2D image file you need.